Soph was an empress of a kitty, and at 19 years of age, she was still a sight to behold. This past spring, little Soph's quality of life began to decrease. She had chronic intestinal problems, was unable to put on weight, and was sleeping all the time. The day that our owner called and said, "Julie, it's time to let Soph go. I don't want her to continue to suffer any longer," I knew she had made the right choice, and we made arrangements for her euthanasia that morning. Little Soph was curled in her owner's lap as I gave her a sedation drug. Once she was relaxed, I gave the final injection that stopped her heart. I looked up at her owner and she smiled at me and said, "I have not seen her lay this peacefully in months. I did not realize how uncomfortable she had been." Little Soph is one of hundreds of euthanasias I have performed in my 10 years of being a veterinarian. I remember them all. In becoming a veterinarian, euthanasia was not one of the most present thoughts in my mind. I thought about difficult disease pathways and their treatments. In veterinary school, euthanasia is very rarely discussed. It may be addressed as part of a treatment plan, but we were given very little, if any, training in the actual process of euthanasia. Euthanasia is actually an interesting word. When we look at its Greek roots, eu, meaning good, thanatos, meaning death, the word literally means good death. But how can death be good? The actual medical procedure of euthanasia is quite simple. It is the arrival of the decision that is difficult. Death is unpredictable. It can either be fast and acute and require only a few minutes to come to a decision, or it could take years of consulting with a client whose pet has a chronic non-reversible disease. We help owners rationalize that the injury of the disease is beyond medical or even financial capabilities. The American Veterinary Medical Association does provide a 100-page manual giving veterinarians specific humane requirements and treatment guidelines in order to provide a good death for our patients. Although terminating an animal's life could be broken down into guidelines and lists, it is within our conscious and moral values that we must come to terms with. Guilt weighs heavily on a veterinarian's mind. It is not so easy to make a choice for another living being. I'd like to tell you a story about a good friend of mine. His name was Reuben, and he was truly a one-of-a-kind dog. I was always delighted whenever I saw Reuben was on my schedule. I knew that no matter what kind of day I was having, I would leave the clinic smiling. I started seeing Reuben over 5 years ago to help him recover from neck surgery. This past year, his physical condition and quality of life began to fail. He wasn't able to go on the walks he so loved. He was falling and could only stand for a few seconds at a time. I remember the moment when his owners called and said it was time to let Reuben go. I could not stop crying. I could rationalize all the medical reasons why it was time to euthanize Reuben, but I did not want to do it. He was my friend, and I did not want to lose him. However, I had a duty and a responsibility to Reuben. As a veterinarian, I had to help this beautiful soul have a good death. He deserved it. After I euthanized Reuben, his owners and I sat around him telling stories of his life, stories that brought smiles to tear-stained faces, stories that I know cannot fix the holes in our hearts, but it sure can string those pieces together. I'd like to tell you a story about another good friend of mine. Her name was Deb, or some of you may have known her as Dr. Deborah Kalkworth. She was a small animal emergency veterinarian here in Dayton, and you may have had the experience of her exceptional veterinary skills when your pet was in a medical crisis. I always say your animal is a pure reflection of your soul. Deb had golden retrievers, and there is no other dog with a more caring and giving heart than a golden. Unbeknownst to many of her friends and colleagues, Deb battled a rare cancer for the last 13 years of her life. She hid her disease. I felt it was to prevent others from feeling her pain. Another golden retriever trait. In the last year of her life, Deb suffered. The cancer had spread to her spine and pelvis, and it eventually consumed the bones of her sacrum. Every movement, every breath was pure agony for her. I remember once sitting next to Deb when she was in the hospital, and she looked at me and said, "Julie, if I were one of my patients, I would have been euthanized by now." Deb and I rarely discussed her cancer, and we never discussed her oncoming death. I wish we had. Deb passed away January 11th, 2017, in the caring hands of hospice, surrounded by family and close friends. I did not want my friend to die, but I did not want her to continue to suffer either. Deb did not have a good death, and this was a hard concept for me to understand. How could this exceptional human being who had helped so many of her patients have a good death, not have the right to choose one for herself? She is the catalyst for why I stand here today. Currently, only 6 states and Washington, D.C. comply with the Death with Dignity Act. Ohio is not one of these states, but legislation could change this soon. In 1997, Oregon was the first state to pass the Death with Dignity Act. This law allows patients to have medical access to dying. You may be familiar with some of these terms: medical aid in dying, physician-assisted death, or physician-assisted suicide. I'd like to clarify these terms. Medical aid in dying is not suicide. It is not assisted suicide, and it is not euthanasia. It is a medical treatment for someone who is dying. We as patients, as dying patients, would have the right to ask a physician to prescribe a medication that would give us a quick death. This law allows us the choice of how and when our death will occur. There are rules and regulations to this law, just as there are in veterinary medicine. We as patients must be legal-aged adults with residency in a participating state. We must also be diagnosed with a terminal disease that has 6 months or less life expectancy, and we must also submit 1 written and 2 oral requests to a physician asking for this treatment. This does not appear too complicated, but just as we know in making the choice for our animals, making the choice to face and accept our own death is the most difficult part of the process. We fear death. We fear the unknowns of death. What will happen to my family? Will death be painful? Will I suffer? I question whether our fears arise from the unknowns of death or whether it is from the fear of lack of control of our death. In the original Hippocratic Oath, physicians once swore to the Greek god Apollo, "I will never give a deadly drug to anybody who asks for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect." In more modern-day oaths, physicians may now swear, "Most especially must I tread with care in matters of life and death. It is given to me to save a life, but it may also be within my power to take a life." This awesome responsibility must be faced with great humbleness and awareness of my own frailty. In the human medical field, whose passion it is to protect and extend human life, it may seem contradictory to provide and accept death. I understand the hesitation. Providing a good death is a veterinarian's duty. It is our ethical obligation. We must navigate a diversity of cultures and beliefs in order to provide their best interests. We are the animals' voices. So, could the human medical field learn from the veterinary community that requesting a good death in times of severe suffering is not a failure of medicine. It is actually empowering us as human beings to gain control over our own finality. If we can choose to give our animals a good death, as was given to Soph and Reuben, should we not also have the right to choose a good death for ourselves, as Deb and so many others wanted and deserved? Is it not time to stop fearing death, grasp control of it, and show ourselves that same love and compassion?